is there for honest poverty that hangs his heed in all that. The coward slave, we pass him by, we dare be poor for all that, and all that. Our toils obscure and all that. The rank is but the guinea stamp, the man's the gout for all that.
Hello, and welcome to Short Circuit, your podcast on the Federal Courts of Appeals. I'm your host, Anthony Sanders, Director of the Center for Judicial Engagement at the Institute for Justice. We're recording this on Friday, January 10th, 2025. This episode will go out on Friday, January 17th, 2025, and 8 days after that is January 25th. And that's why you heard that little bit of a poem at the beginning of this show, because January 25th is Burns Night, the night when people recite poetry by Robert Burns and eat haggis and drink whiskey. Well, if you're Scottish, at least. Now, we did a whole show about Burns Night a year ago. It was a lot of fun. My colleague Brian Morris, who's here again today, was on it. We're going to do a little bit about that again. This is kind of a reprise of that show at the end. So if you're here for the poetry, skip to the end. You can skip all this law business that we're going to do in the meantime. So don't worry about that. We have the few lines you heard are from a real Scotswoman. She is not a fallacy. She is a real Scotswoman, Nicola McCoy. She's a friend of the show, and so you're going to hear her at the end. So in the meantime, though, we have some law. And for that law, one of our lawyers is Brian Morris, my colleague at the Institute for Justice, a Kentucky boy who's here to give us another Sixth Circuit case. So you'll hear from Brian in a little bit. But first of all, welcome. How you doing, Brian?
Hey, it's great to be back for Burns Night, Anthony. Let's see if I get this right. It's Slán Chava, which I think means cheers or good health in Scottish. So if, it's great to be back for Burns Night 2025. Well,
you know more Old Scots than I do, because Slán Chava, is that Old Scots, or is that like Erse or Gaelic as they call it?
I think the latter is what at least Google told me it was.
Okay, very, very, very good. Because there's Highland Scots and Lowland Scots, and you got to get the Old Scots. It's very confusing. We won't go into that. We will instead go to so Burns is the Bard of Scotland. We have the Bard of Austin with us, which is Jeff Rose. So Jeff, how are you?
I'm doing great, Anthony. Thanks. Great to be back.
And Jeff is going to bring us the latest abstention news from the Fourth Circuit in a little bit, from the hills of West Virginia, I believe. Mm-hmm. But first we have a major announcement. Now, this is the announcement probably I have been the most excited ever to give on Short Circuit. So I will try and keep it brief, but it is very exciting. We'll talk about it more in coming weeks, but here it is. So it has been 10 years now since Short Circuit began. Our first newsletter went out on February 13th, 2015. Our first podcast was just a couple weeks after that. I was not part of the business. I was part of IJ, but was not part of Short Circuit at that time. But it was run by our intrepid editor, John Ross, who is still editing the newsletter week after week, and has, of course, moved on to big things with the Bound by Oath series. To celebrate those 10 years, we are holding a party, and all of you are invited. It's also a show, so it's not just, we have some snacks and you come over and talk Short Circuit with us. This is like a big event. And if you want to come, you need to RSVP, but you need to RSVP soon. It is in Washington, D.C. at the Studio Theater, which is in the Logan Circle area. It is going to be Thursday, April 3rd, 2025. If you want to go, click the link in the show notes or find it somewhere on IJ's page. I'm sure it'll be easy to find. You can also find it through the Short Circuit newsletter and RSVP. It is going to be a party. We're going to have some time to mingle. That'd be great. We'd love to see Short Circuit fans who can make it, who live in the area, or, if you want to fly in for this, that's great. Please come. But it is going to be a show where we talk about Short Circuit and the wider world of the federal courts of appeals. So it's going to have 3 acts. The first act is going to be John Ross, my colleague Bob McNamara, who is our Deputy Director of Litigation, and our old friend Clark Neely, now Vice President at the Cato Institute. And in the past, he had my job, Director of the Center of Judicial Engagement. He was a IJ litigator for many years. The 3 of them were there at the beginning when Short Circuit began. So they are going to talk about the origins. Then Act 2 is going to be a live Short Circuit Live, we call it, a podcast recording. That is going to have Anya Bidwell as the host, my colleague and permanent guest host here at Short Circuit, and then 2 mega guests. One is the one, the only, the blog father, Eugene Volokh, Professor Eugene Volokh of the Hoover Institution, formerly of UCLA Law. All of you, I'm sure, in some way have seen him or heard of him. He runs the Volokh Conspiracy, the popular legal blog. That hosts Short Circuit every Friday, and we are forever thankful to Eugene for allowing us to do that. And so he will be one of the guests. The other will be Rafi Melkonian. So Rafi is a partner in a law firm in Houston. He's a very accomplished Texas litigator, but he also is known in certain parts as the Dean of Appellate Twitter, because he has spread the legal news for many years on that platform that is now called something else. So that is Act 2. Act 3 is going to be an even bigger deal. It is a panel on the future of the federal courts of appeals. It will have my colleague Ben Field as the moderator, and then retired Judge Diane Wood of the Seventh Circuit, that I'm sure many of you know of. Just recently retired Judge Kent Jordan of the Third Circuit, and Adam Liptak of the New York Times. And they will talk about the future of the federal courts of appeals, all kinds of matters like that. And then we'll have a reception, food and drinks after that. So if you can make it, it should be a super fun evening, super interesting. And sign up. You can RSVP. So that is all being said. We'll get on to our show. First, we're going to hear from Jeff and this abstention case from the Fourth Circuit. And it's not, we've talked a lot about younger abstention on the show in the last few years. This is yet another permutation of abstention, Pullman abstention. So tell us about that, Jeff.
Well, as everybody knows, if you want to be a constitutional lawyer, you have to be a procedural nerd. And one of the biggest areas of nerddom is abstention. And abstention is this wild and woolly labyrinth of doctrines that amount to federal courts don't feel like hearing cases. And we have a new case out of the Fourth Circuit, which was sort of music to my ears, actually, as a constitutional lawyer, because in this case, the Fourth Circuit reversed an abstention decision. And let me give you the background. So West Virginia, like most states in the United States, perhaps all of them, require school children to be vaccinated. That's whether you're in public school, private school, whatever, you have to be vaccinated. The state statute has an exemption for health reasons. So if a doctor says, for whatever reason, vaccinations are inappropriate medically, you can get an exemption. There is no religious exemption. There are folks out there who object to vaccinations on religious grounds. And so a couple in West Virginia brought a 1983, Section 1983 suit under the Free Exercise Clause in the Northern District of West Virginia to get a ruling that a mandatory vaccination violated their First Amendment rights. So the district court poured them out on abstention, something called Pullman abstention. Now, the most familiar form of abstention is younger abstention. And the nutshell of younger abstention is federal courts won't hear a case when there is an ongoing state court proceeding. Younger abstention was originally for the criminal context, not wanting federal courts to interfere in ongoing state criminal prosecutions. It was then expanded to civil cases. It was then expanded to state agency proceedings. And so younger started to look like an exception that swallowed the rule, although courts have reiterated and the Fourth Circuit does in this Pullman abstention case, that federal courts have a duty to hear cases when their jurisdiction is properly invoked. Now, let's get back to the West Virginia case. This is about Pullman abstention, less familiar, but the nutshell there is, if there is a state law issue that is unclear and undecided, but if decided, it could prove dispositive and moot the federal constitutional issue, then a federal court can decline to hear the case and allow the state courts to solve the problem on state law grounds. Now, here's the twist. In this case in West Virginia about the free exercise clause, the parents brought one claim and one claim only, Section 1983, free exercise claim. The state of West Virginia recently passed a law that had become effective that was a state religious freedom statute. Now, it's possible that under the religious freedom statute, they would be able to assert an exemption to the state law vaccination mandate. They did not, however, bring a supplemental state law claim. They could have, but they didn't. They didn't sue in state court either, just bringing that state law statutory religious freedom claim. But the district court, citing Pullman abstention, said, you could have brought a state law claim. And if you had brought a state law claim and litigated it, maybe the state courts would have had an opportunity to resolve your federal constitutional claim on that separate state law ground, or which is to say, the federal question would have been avoided because the state law thing would have resolved it. So in a nutshell, what the federal court was saying is, if it is possible to bring a state law claim that might wind up mooting your federal constitutional claim, you had an affirmative duty to bring that or to have the state courts litigate that first, which sounds an awful lot like an exhaustion requirement. Now, we're burrowing even further into the weeds of procedural nerddom.
That's what we're here for, Jeff.
That's what we're here for.
Dig away. Dig that hole.
So in the early 1980s, in a case called Patsy, the Supreme Court said there is no exhaustion requirement for federal constitutional claims. You need an injury, you need standing, but you don't actually have to go and litigate issues before state administrative bodies or in state courts before they are ripe for adjudication in federal court. Now, the interpretation of Pullman in this West Virginia case sounds an awful lot like that you had to bring a state court claim in state court, get the state courts to weigh in somehow on this state law issue before federal courts would consider your federal constitutional claim. Now, set aside that if you brought a case in state court under this state statute, you almost certainly under preclusion doctrine would also have to bring your federal constitutional claim in state court, and you wouldn't be able to actually litigate it in federal court. But that's another whole procedural morass. But anyway, so these poor folks get poured out, and I sympathize with them sort of losing on this because this happens at the Institute for Justice all the time. We spend an enormous amount of time reading cases and designing our complaints, designing our cases to try to wend our way through this procedural thicket, and abstention is one of them. But anyway, they go up to the Fourth Circuit, and the panel divides 2-1, and the two-judge majority says no. This is not, number one, federal courts are required to exercise their jurisdiction. Abstention is an exceptional exception that must be specially justified. And here, this is just amounting to the kind of exhaustion requirement that the Supreme Court has long rejected, that these folks brought a federal claim. It was properly teed up. It's the only claim they brought. And a federal court can't dismiss a properly pled federal claim on the theory that you could have but didn't bring a state statutory claim, which might, if decided in your favor, moot your federal constitutional claim. Now, there was a dissent, a pointed dissent, and that the pointed dissent sort of sent shivers down my spine the entire time I was reading it, because it reads like a very, very smart judge working hard to interpret federal procedural doctrines in a way that make it feel as though you're tiptoeing across a minefield if you're a litigant, and that you can be surprised at any moment when your claim blows up underneath you. And basically amounts to, no matter what you do, your federal constitutional claims can't be heard, either now or in federal court or until something else happens. So these guys are going to get to the country roads are going to take them home, back to West Virginia, to the district court, and they will be able to have their federal constitutional claim heard. On the merits, I think that it's improbable, because the Fourth Circuit just 10 years ago had upheld the constitutionality of a vaccination requirement on identical grounds. So, I didn't dig very deeply into the ultimate merits of this, but it sounds like they're probably going to have, their only hope is either en banc review in the Fourth Circuit, or maybe this goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court. But anyway, that's the what it means to be a kind of an enterprising constitutional lawyer. But this is one where, at least from my point of view as an IJ constitutional lawyer, the good guys won, and we have some good abstention doctrine on the books. And by good, I mean a decision saying that abstention doesn't apply and the federal courts should hear the claim.
Brian, please don't abstain from giving your thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, I was happy to see a federal court take its job seriously to decide the merits of a case. But I think Jeff's right. Back when I first started at IJ, I think there was two things that genuinely shocked me. And it was, one, just how many different ways the government violates the Constitution. And second, how willing courts were to ignore these violations by finding some kind of cheap procedural loophole to kick the case without addressing the merits. So good on the Fourth Circuit here. I did have one question. I mean, I'm not super familiar with Pullman abstention, but I mean, would the dissent just say, stay the case and come back if/when the state law issue is ever decided? I mean, is it just kind of hang out there in perpetuity?
I don't fully get it, because part of the I remember I had a Fourth Circuit case years ago, and I remember writing, we had gotten poured out on a procedural ground, and the state had taken the position that we should go through some state proceeding. And I remember writing in a footnote in the brief that the state was just trying to set up an abstention trap. Like, it was saying, well, your case can't be heard now until you do this administrative thing they were demanding we do. But of course, if we had done the administrative proceeding that they were demanding, they would have been in court saying that younger abstention applied. Mm-hmm. And so it just seemed to me that what the takeaway from the dissent was, you should, I guess, go to state court and get a state court to rule on this supposedly unclear state law issue. But again, that just opens the door to other things, because you can't go into court and serially litigate claims about the same thing. You can't go and get a judgment in state court, litigate that for 3 years, and then go into federal court and say, oh, by the way, the state courts ruled on this. Now I want to bring this separate First Amendment thing. I guess if you brought it in federal court, they could stay it, and then you'd get to come back in. But
yeah, I think that can happen.
It can happen, but I mean, believe me,
it's not fun.
That things can happen. Yeah, that things can happen. Of course, it would take forever. You'd go through, you'd come back with your state court thing, and the federal court would hear it. But it would take years and years and years, and that's just not the case you brought. As constitutional lawyers, one of the things we do oftentimes is we want to tee up specific issues. And one way to tee up specific issues is you only bring certain kinds of claims. And, in this case, the dissent is saying, you don't get to do that. You have to write a complaint that includes this claim. And then I'm going to send you off to make a completely different court under a completely different sovereign rule on this claim that you didn't want to bring before I'll listen to yours.
One thing that I just don't see the dissent grappling with is that usually, even if you accept Pullman abstention as a legitimate thing, which is a different question, Pullman abstention at its core is about right, the actual statute that you are complaining about is unclear, and maybe you haven't, the thing you're complaining about isn't against the law anyway. So, and that's because it's a statutory interpretation thing, right? The statute, the regulations, sometimes they get super complicated. It's just like, I don't even know what it means. And so please go figure it out before the federal courts get involved. And that, sometimes that can be taken care of with a certification to the state Supreme Court. But I think sometimes federal courts don't want to have to deal with that. It's just so complicated. And so please go to state court. This is not that at all. This is that there's this new cause of action. And so the dissent wants to read the new cause of action like into quote unquote state law as this thicket it doesn't want to get involved with. This is a whole another level of conceptual, morass.
Right. Yeah. You can imagine sort of the classic Pullman abstention context, if there is one. Like I'm in Texas right now, and, somebody might sue and then, bring a federal constitutional claim about the distribution of oil royalty money. And, there's a new Texas statute that has come out about how to divide oil revenue that comes from a specific kind of fracking in a certain kind of place in the Permian Basin, if done using these specific machines. And the federal court might say, I have no idea. Realistically, I can't judge whether this is constitutional or not because I have no idea how this Texas law actually apportions the revenue. And so that's sort of the Pullman justification. You go to state court and say, Texas, how the heck does this new oil royalty law actually function in your state?
And Pullman itself was a Texas case. I don't know if you remember, it has very seedy origins. It was about basically discrimination against black workers on railroads, I think.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
then Justice Frankfurter was like, I don't want to get involved with all that. And so go to state court.
Right.
Well, one thing we will get involved with, and the federal courts are very involved with now, is net neutrality. And it seems like that's not really a thing and won't be a thing again in the future. But it has been a roller coaster ride the last many years. And so we have a case from the Sixth Circuit about net neutrality, but it's also about our old departed friend Chevron deference and a lot of other things. So, Brian, tell us this story. I'm sure you are a broadband internet customer, so you're probably self-interested in this tale. But curious as to your thoughts.
I am. This is a case that came out of the Sixth Circuit last week. I think on January 2nd. So starting the year off with a bang. This case is actually a bunch of consolidated cases from different circuits challenging, like you said, the FCC's net neutrality regulations. And I think the challenges were originally filed in a bunch of different circuits, 1st, 5th, 6th, 8th, 9th, 11th, and I think the DC circuit as well. And if I understand the process correctly, when there's a final agency order, everyone kind of gets 10 days and you can file where you want to file. And back in the day, I think it used to be kind of a race to the courthouse to see which circuit would get to decide the issue. But now there's a rule where there's essentially a circuit lottery to decide who will actually hear the challenge. And each circuit gets a numbered ping pong ball that gets placed in a wooden drum, which the drum is actually that's in the rule. It actually requires that, and then a ball's randomly selected from the drum, and that's the circuit that hears the challenge.
And it's unfortunately not public or broadcast.
It should be live.
They do
streamed.
it in this clerk's office somewhere. I remember when the vaccine mandate stuff was going on with this. Our friend Sean Marotta on Twitter was explaining how all this works, and I remember that unfortunately you don't get to watch the ping pong ball like a lotto drawing, which I was saddened by.
That would be probably one of the hottest streams in the federal courts of appeals. But I mean, the Sixth Circuit won the OSHA vaccine mandate too, so they've been on a bit of a heater. Yeah. But here, so in the Sixth Circuit, the FCC case ends up with 3 conservative judges. It's Judge Griffin, Kethledge, and Bush. And Judge Griffin wrote this opinion, which an interesting tidbit. I don't know if you know, Anthony, in the Sixth Circuit, the presiding judge assigns a presumptive writer before the oral argument. So here,
okay.
Judge Griffin would have been the senior judge, so he decided to keep it for himself. So this is a challenge to the FCC, which is the federal agency in charge of regulating radio, TV, satellite, broadband internet, cable, different types of communications. And like you mentioned, the FCC wants to regulate broadband internet providers, which think of, we have Xfinity, you can have AT&T or Spectrum, and they want to apply what's considered net neutrality principles, which my understanding is it would require internet providers to essentially treat all internet traffic equally, meaning the providers couldn't vary speeds for certain websites, either to prioritize some websites or to block access to other websites through, you can think of like throttling or paid priority, where maybe some websites pay a premium to get higher speeds. There's just a ton of amicus briefs in this case, and some free speech groups argue that net neutrality would prevent internet providers from controlling what content consumers can access or see. But like many agency cases, this case is not about whether or not net neutrality is or is not a good idea. It's about whether or not the FCC has the statutory authority to do it. It's not about Congress's authority to pass net neutrality rules. It's whether the FCC can fit kind of the net neutrality rules under existing statutes. And, going back, the last time it was a Burns night, Anthony, we did the Texas book ban case.
Yeah.
And we have to decide, would Burns himself, where would he fall on what side of the line? And I guess, maybe you could disagree, but I would think Burns might fall on the side of net neutrality and more access to more speech.
I mean, he wasn't a big, a scholar of agency law or, constitutional law for that matter. So he probably just liked sticking it to the big guys.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite lines. I couldn't go without a little poetry, but one of my favorite lines: "Here is freedom to them that would read. Here is freedom to them that would write. There is none ever feared that the truth should be heard, but they whom the truth would indict." So maybe,
wow.
Yeah,
thank you.
It's good. But for the FCC, the problem in this case is how they went about doing the net neutrality rules, which the statutory authority to regulate these broadband providers depends on the type of communication. So if something's designated as a common carrier, then the FCC has significant regulatory oversight. If not, it retains only a pretty limited ability to regulate. So for a common carrier is someone like an airline or a railroad or a shipping company, someone that provides a general service to the public. And when you do that, there's certain rules that you can't discriminate in different ways. For the FCC, to decide whether or not someone's a common carrier, what this case really boils down to is a question of statutory interpretation about whether or not these internet service providers are what are called, quote, telecommunications services or, quote, information services. If they're telecommunications, they're a common carrier, and the FCC can apply these kind of heavy-handed regulations. If they're information services, they cannot. And for for about the first 20 or so years, the FCC's position was that the internet providers were information services, not telecommunications. So that would mean no regulation. But the FCC first changed this interpretation during the Obama administration when they first tried to do these net neutrality principles. The Trump administration, the first time in office, changed it back. Both of those were challenged in the D.C. Circuit, which upheld the changes under, I guess now we'd have to cue the villain music of, like dun, 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 Chevron deference. So
including brand X deference.
Exactly.
That's where I forgot that's where brand X, which was kind of the epitome of Chevron deference.
Exactly. So for this challenge, now the Biden's FCC went back to the Obama interpretation so that it can regulate these internet providers. Judge Griffin, I don't think he would hide that he's not a fan of the administrative state. So he had his line to kind of show this flip-flopping. It was, quote, "This order issued during the Biden administration undoes the order issued during the first Trump administration, which undid the order issued during the Obama administration, which undid orders issued during the Bush and Clinton administrations." So now that Chevron is no more, Judge Griffin previews that he has to apply Loper Bright, which means that he can, quote, "end the FCC's vacillations," or their inability to kind of decide what definition these internet providers fall under. And then he's going to go on to say why the FCC exceeded its authority and why internet providers are information services under the statute. And I'll say, reading this case, I don't know about Anthony and Jeff. I mean, I think the statutory text is a bit of a mess.
Yeah.
Judge Kethledge during oral argument even was talking about kind of the circular reasoning where if you're talking about, telecommunication services, the definition basically says telecommunication services means the offering of telecommunications. So there's not a whole lot of clarity here, which I think is important, is why the end of Chevron is so important in this case. Justice Scalia called the Communications Act that issue, and I think once Justice Scalia called the Communications Act a model of ambiguity and self-contradiction. So in previous challenges, the D.C. Circuit deferred to the FCC's interpretation under Chevron both times, which I think kind of highlights people's frustrations with Chevron. Is the first challenge under the Obama administration, they said under Chevron deference, one interpretation was completely reasonable, and then the opposite interpretation under the Trump administration was equally reasonable. So it was contradictory positions, both upheld under Chevron deference, which readers, not readers, but listeners might remember. So step one of Chevron asks if a statute's ambiguous, and as Scalia and Judge Kethledge, and even at oral argument, Judge Griffin even said this statute is ambiguous. If it's ambiguous, you go to step two of Chevron, which asks just if the agency's interpretation is reasonable. You don't ask if it's the best reading or the correct reading, just if it's a reasonable reading. And both times the D.C. Circuit upheld it under that Chevron step two. So again, I don't think this statute's the easiest to understand. But now with Loper Bright, the Sixth Circuit can't defer to the FCC's interpretation. So it doesn't matter if the FCC has a permissible or reasonable interpretation. Now, under Loper Bright, the court must decide the single best meaning of the statute. And it's interesting that, even Judge Kethledge at oral argument, some of the attorneys wanted to talk about the major questions doctrine, which kind of gets away from the statutory text. And Judge Kethledge at one point even said, hey, it's been 16 years and we finally get to talk about the best meaning. So let's talk about the statute. So it seems like judges are kind of at least eager to shed Chevron deference and look at the actual language of the statute.
Well, I was just going to jump in. I mean, this was an interesting case. I didn't read it as sort of a statutory scholar, but I have to say they spent some time in the case trying to explain what an information services provider was. I had absolutely no idea what it meant. Like, I had the distinction as explained in the case between a common carrier and a mere information services provider didn't make any sense to me. It was also clear that the statute itself was the premise of the statute itself is that we live in the Chevron world. Like, in other words, we as Congress don't have to write anything that's particularly precise because we live in a Chevron world and we're just kind of farming out the actual legislative work to the agency, which will just make up all of the rules. And so, one of the consequences of the Loper Bright thing isn't just for courts and administrative agencies, but at some point, sort of Congress is going to have to catch up and say and realize that we're not writing statutes anymore in the Chevron world. Like, we actually have to fill in a few more details, and maybe that it shouldn't be, kind of close to gibberish. Oh, the other impression I wanted to share is that over the last couple of days, there have been some sort of funny things. That President Trump's inauguration is coming up, and a number of these tech billionaires and their companies have been tripping over themselves to donate what appears to be the standard $1 million now to the Trump inauguration fund. And Facebook the other day released a video saying they're getting rid of their fact-checking, content moderation type thing right on the eve of President Trump's thing. And of course, everybody sits around and says to themselves, like, oh, these conniving billionaires and stuff like that. But of course, like, the reason why they're doing this is because in the past, every time there's been a new president, there has been a regulatory flip-flop. And, the theory behind Chevron deference is that, well, we're going to allow these experts to arrive at the optimal interpretation or something. But, Judge Gorsuch is quoted in this opinion saying, no, what actually happens is all of this stuff just kind of goes up for grabs. Because everything is up for grabs under Chevron, and that there are going to be political decisions made in the agencies, they're going to be flip-flopping, which means you're going to get the likes of Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and everybody else in that thing tripping over themselves to obtain influence over the regulatory process. And so it's not just a question of, conniving billionaires. It's that we have created a system in which they can thrive by getting rules flip-flopped on administration. So anyway, that was just a sort of, it felt like the real world implications are sort of playing out on the eve of the inauguration for me, without making comments, implying one way or the other politically about, anything like that. It was just sort of an interesting spectacle in light of this case.
Yeah, I'll get to that point in a moment, Jeff. That's a really good point. But the statute itself, I like how the court walks through the statute here, but it's like almost circular how Congress set this up in 1996 when it added this language, because it's like information services itself is partly defined through telecommunications.
Uh-huh.
So the actual text is not super helpful in some ways, but they do kind of point out when you take a step back and you look at the rest of the statute, then you kind of get what's going on better. And you do get a sense that there is a difference between sending data that, we think of as like stuff you do on your computer and augment yourself, and then just your voice through really what they meant was phone calls, right? Telecommunications. And so there is a difference in there. It's just then, what is the difference between sending an email and sending a computer program and all of that? This probably that makes the most sense as the way to solve through that. But yeah, it's not like Congress did anyone any favors on that. On flip-flopping of administrations, there is the critique that, Congress is still going to punt on these issues sometimes. Before, I think there was this understanding of it was as robust a thing about flip-flopping between administrations and the administrative state. There was the old saying, well, we'll let the court sort it out, right? So we'll pass this law and let the court sort it out. We're kind of back to that now. Let the court sort it out. And that's still going to happen. And so, the critique is, well, now the power is just in the courts instead of in the presidency. And at least there, it's democratic, yada, yada, yada. I think there's good arguments that the courts are more insulated from those political pressures and giving $1 million to the inaugural fund. But the system's not perfect. And really,
no.
The best thing to do is for Congress to do its job and also Congress to do a lot less. Sometimes Congress does have to do things, and here we are. But I think it's going to be messy however we do it, and this seems like a little bit of a less messy way. And so seems like we're heading in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, and I would hope that one of the things that Loper Bright causes is for Congress to kind of act a little bit more and to write some better statutes. And I think part of the problem with this case shows is you're trying to fit the FCC is trying to come up with these net neutrality regulations and fitting it into a 1996 statute, which is obviously the landscape of the internet today is very different than what it was, with dial-up internet and, connecting to AOL.
Yeah, I had some trips down memory lane, them talking about the dial-up internet. That was for people of an older bent, such as Jeff and I, what probably was some interesting reading.
I remember being a graduate student in the 90s at the University of Chicago and getting you get those AOL discs in the mail constantly. Like you just, trying to get you to sign up for various services.
And no one can use the phone when you go online because you tie up the landline. And so there's like 2 hours where no one can even leave you a message.
Right.
So yeah, I mean that's part of the problem is the statute has this list of gerunds of different things, and it doesn't really fit. But you're right. I think the Judge Griffin's best analogy to try to clarify it is it's with this telecommunications, really what they're thinking about is a phone call, right? Where it's just a conduit where there's no change, where you have somebody pick up a phone and the phone line is just transmitting the language back and forth. And the internet today is very different, where no one in this case disputed that the websites themselves, like Netflix or Amazon or somebody, or information services, because you can retrieve this information from the websites. And the internet service providers is not quite like the telephone company, and it's maybe kind of like the Netflix or Amazon. It's probably something in between, and Congress could certainly clarify that. But the thing I think that this case is also a good example is the other effect of Loper Bright, which I'm personally excited about, is I think that the DC Circuit in the past on these kind of difficult cases might put their thumb and scale in favor of the agency or the government and say, I don't know, this is kind of hard, and that agency interpretation seems reasonable enough. It's good enough, so let's go with that. And I think the court at least does a commendable job to say, oh, no, we're going to wrestle with the language. We're going to try to figure it out. We're going to come up with what we think the best interpretation is and not just take the government's word for it. And if Congress needs to fix it, it can fix it. But at least moving forward, it's kind of like what would happen with two private parties if they're arguing over a contract, right? And what the language means, the court has to figure out. It doesn't get to defer to one over the other. So it's at least we get to see that in this case.
Yeah, and I think there's one, maybe one other interesting point is the entirely parallel First Amendment litigation that's going on in other parts of the legal universe, in which the big platforms are fighting about whether they are common carriers or whether they have free speech rights when it comes to making decisions about sort of editorial decisions about what kind of things get put on their website. And the big, when it comes to if there's content on the internet from a platform that harms somebody, the big platforms are like, whoa, we're just passive. We're just basically common carriers. We're like telephone lines. People are just passing their defamatory messages, through our social media, but it's not on us. We're no different than the phone lines. But then on the other hand, if they want to actively moderate the content of their website, they're like, well, we're nothing like a phone line. We're absolutely like, speakers with our free, we're like newspapers. We should be able to exercise editorial control. And so, there's this significant debate going on in the First Amendment realm about whether or not internet providers are common carriers or they are free speech speakers, like the three of us right now. And all of this is going to sort of converge in the next year or two. And it's going to be very interesting to see it play out.
Yeah, a reminder that in reading this opinion, they talk about just in terms of statutory interpretation and how different parts of the statute use the words. You see Section 280, which is what you were just talking about, Jeff. The shield on liability for publishers, so they can curate their the comment section basically, and that was part of this huge, much bigger scheme of internet regulation and allowing trying to stop a lot of regulation, but also they had this part about keeping children safe online, which was some of the Section 280 stuff, which then some of it was found unconstitutional, but the other stuff wasn't, and so that's still in there. And what a mess! If maybe it would. I don't trust Congress to do stuff usually, but maybe this is an area with 30 years of technological change where maybe they could go back to the drawing board and do a little bit better job. But I'm kind of rambling now, but I do kind of worry about opening up that box of chocolates, and we'll see what we get because of the zeitgeist that I think of free speech has changed a little bit, like you're talking about, Jeff, and God knows what might happen then. Mm-hmm. But that is not for us to comment on today. Instead, what we're going to be commenting on is an 18th century poet. So we're going to close with this poem by Robert Burns. Now, give you the back, like, why are we doing this? Give you the background of this. So you are all welcome. In the show notes, we'll put a link to go back to the episode from last year where we had these fun quotes from Robert Burns. We did a couple poems. That was fun. It's just really fun that there's this like ceremony where Scottish people drink whiskey, eat haggis, and do poetry once a year. Like, that's just cool. So we kind of, for fun, interwove it into a short circuit a year ago because it was coming out on the actual day because it was a Thursday last year, and we used to release the show on Thursdays, and so that was fun. And we had a friend of my family who's a young actress read the poem to a mouse to close the show out. So that was cool. But like just as we were getting ready for the show, another friend of mine, a connection of his, was a real Scotswoman. Again, Nicola McCoy, her name is. She lives in Scotland. She's Scottish, and she performs, which I guess is like half the people in Scotland anyway. But anyway, she does a good job. And so he was like, hey, I could go up with her and she could do the poem. Well, it was too late for that year. But I thought, well, we'll maybe keep that in reserve. And so she was willing to do it this year. And I told her, you can pick whatever poem you want and we'll just play it at the end of the show. And so she picked A Man's a Man for All Dat, which we're about to play. Now, Brian, the funny thing is last year, you actually read some lines of this poem because it was like kind of your pick. And do you remember why that was or why you're kind of drawn to it?
I can't remember now, but I'm eager. Maybe I'll have to compare. I know I stumbled over the pronunciation, so I'm sure will do a much better job.
Yeah, I think it was like, it speaks to the common man and it kind of has some IJ themes to it in that way. She said it's often used by like kind of more socialist politicians because it's, it kind of has this redistributive quality to it if you listen to the words. But it's also really just about equality, I think. And so, you can get some kind of eminent domain abuse, Suzette Kilo reading between the lines, that kind of thing. So we will close now with the reading of the poem. So please be sure to follow Short Circuit. Listen to our podcast through YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all other podcast platforms. And now, without further ado, Nicola McCoy and A Man's a Man for All Dat.
Is there for honest poverty that hangs his heed and all that? The coward slave, we pass him by, we dare be poor for all that, and all that. Our toils obscure and all that. The rank is but the guinea's stamp, the man's the gout for all that. What though on hamely fare we dine, we're hodden grey and all that? Gie fools their silks and knaves their wine, a man's a man for all that. For all that, and all that, their tinsel show and all that. The honest man, though eersy poor, is king of men for all that. Ye see yon Birkie, cad a lord, he struts and stares and all that. Though hundreds worship at his word, he's but a coof for all that. For all that, and all that, his ribbon star, and all that. The man o' independent mind, he looks and laughs at all that. A prince can mak a belted knight, a marquis duke and all that. But an honest man's abon his might, good faith he mauna fa that. For all that, and all that, their dignities and all that, the pith o' sense and pride o' worth are higher rank than all that. Then let us pray that come it may, as come it will, for all that. That sense and worth o' air o' the earth shall bear the gree and all that. For all that, and all that, it's coming yet for all that. That man to man the world o' air shall brothers be for all that.